So last year, somebody published a fake tweet from Chiquita Banana. You know, the company that you probably buy your bananas from. And the fake tweet said Chiquita Banana had overthrown the government of Brazil, which is kind of funny and obviously not true. But the even funnier part about that tweet was another tweet was posted from an account that really did look like the Chiquita Banana account. And they said that it was a fake tweet and they have obviously not overthrown the government of Brazil, and nor have they overthrown any government since 1954. And that tweet is both hysterical and horrifically accurate. And I will elaborate on that point because today's farm crime video is all about the bloody history of the banana republics and the time that Chiquita Banana overthrew the government. Welcome back to Goldshaw Farm. My name is Morgan, and occasionally I like to tell you guys stories that combine farms and crimes. And yes, the bloody history of the banana is our focus. You know, human history is riddled with bloody crops. You know, you have the opium wars between China and Britain in the 19th century. You had the sugar trade literally fueling human bondage, with Europeans colonizing the Americas and bringing Africans over as slaves to work sugar plantations. And then arguments could be made that the mechanized processing of cotton led to the American Civil War. But one of the less discussed historical atrocities is what happened with bananas and the United Fruit Company specifically. And now you might be hearing the United Fruit Company and that name just sounding really generic and not ringing any bells, but I am certain that you guys know about Chiquita Banana.
When it says Chiquita, it's a very good day to buy bananas.
Now, bananas flourish in warm, hot, tropical climates. They're usually grown very close to the equator. Each plant can grow roughly 20 feet tall, and on each one is a bunch known as a hand. Once that hand is harvested, the banana stalk's usually cut down and it regrows back up, and it can take up to 9 months from start to finish to grow a single hand of bananas. And the banana plant is very fragile and susceptible to disease, and that can cause a lot of problems for raising bananas. But now, in my opinion, one of the most surprising things about bananas is that they're so gosh darn cheap. Like, just go to the grocery store and look at it side by side by an apple. An apple is actually much more expensive than a banana. Yet for us here in Vermont, for example, apple trees can grow like weeds and are very easy to come upon on the wild. Meanwhile, you have this risky, fragile crop that's produced thousands of miles away, and it's much cheaper at the grocery store. And I do believe that a lot of that has to do with the exploitive practice and history of the banana and how it came to be popular here, particularly in North America, but really all around the world. You see, because for thousands of years, the banana stayed as a very regional fruit because it could only be grown in certain areas. And explorers like Ferdinand Magellan might have popularized it with Europeans, but it really didn't grow as a popular fruit around the world until the 19th century with the advent of steamships, railroads, and refrigeration. Because if it's not moved quickly and if it's not handled properly, a banana turns to mush very, very quickly. Now, the first company in the United States dedicated to growing and importing bananas was founded in 1870, and by 1876 at the World's Fair there, the bananas were a massive hit. You know, it's actually kind of funny. The bananas that were at the 1876 World Fair were like one of the big hits. The other big hit was the telephone. And so Alexander Graham Bell had his telephone there. There was also the banana there. Yeah, for the inventors of the banana telephone, I'm sure that that was a monumental moment in history. And it was really at this point that the banana became popular in America. People were consuming them left and right, particularly in places like New York City where they were easier to import. In fact, the NYPD ultimately instituted an ordinance that prohibited the throwing of banana peels on the ground because they were having a massive problem of people slipping on banana peels. Yes, slipping on a banana peels was a real problem confronted by the city of New York in the 1870s. And now this is probably the point in our story where a character by the name of Minor Cooper Keith enters the picture. Now, Minor Cooper Keith was born in 1848 in New York City. His father was a wealthy guy in the lumber industry. His mother came from a wealthy family in the railroad industry. And he grew up in this very privileged lifestyle of, you know, going to private schools and that sort of thing. And when he was 16, his family purchased him a cattle ranch out in Texas. Yes, this guy absolutely gave off some seriously strong Kendall Roy vibes.
My boy Squiggle cooked up this beat for me. Check it.
And so Miner left New York City and went out to Texas and started running this cattle ranch. And yes, that might sound like a weird thing, but apparently back in the 1800s, wealthy kids were running cattle ranches out west all the time, so it was totally normal. But he only did this for a little bit of time because in 1871, Miner's uncle came to him and asked him to help on a special project. You see, Miner's uncle had been commissioned to build a railroad in Costa Rica, and so the idea of going down to the jungle and doing this project seemed attractive and adventurous and interesting to Miner, and so he said farewell to the cattle ranch and headed on down to Costa Rica to help his uncle build this railroad. Now at this point, you know, Central America did not have a lot of infrastructure and it was very much still like untouched virgin jungle. And for folks with a colonizing mindset going down to Central America, you know, they were very much thinking about it in terms of taming this untamed land. You know, they had to contend with thick jungle and brush. They had to contend with all sorts of diseases. And it was really difficult building this railroad going from the capital of Costa Rica all the way to the coast. And over the course of roughly the first 3 years, the crew building this Costa Rican railroad had like 5,000 casualties. Yes, 5,000 people dying building this railroad. And among those casualties were Miner's uncle and brothers. And since all of those folks had died off, by 1874, Miner found himself in charge of this crazy railroad building project. And so Miner just continued to grind the machine onward. You know, by I think it was like 1882, they had been working on this railroad for like 11 years and they had eventually run out of cash, and Miner was sort of struggling and trying to figure out what to do. You know, by this point he had sunk his entire adult life into constructing this railroad. It still wasn't complete. He was worried about being a failure and he was struggling figuring out how to keep his workers fed and going. But one of the advantages that they did have was the fact that they did have bananas.
There's always money in the banana stand!
One of the things that Miner had found while building the railroad was that these banana trees very much grew very well in this climate. And so basically just along the route of the railroad, they started installing banana plantations, really with the primary goal of feeding the workers who were building the railroad. And now he was out of money. He didn't have prospects for completing the railroad. They were still miles and miles away from the capital, and they had a lot more work to do. And so Miner, much like a tech executive looking to score some fresh venture capital, decided to do a pivot.
I'm pivoting.
I'm pivoting. I'm pivoting.
I mean, like, think about it, right? He's got this railroad that is partially built. The only thing that goes along the railroad are all these banana plantations. And to top it all off, in the United States, bananas were starting to become very, very popular.
I know about popular.
And so what Miner did was he slowed down on building the railroad and he focused his attention towards exporting bananas to the United States. Now Miner's pivot ended up happening at the exact right time, and by 1883 the guy owned 3 different banana export companies, and I think that had to do with geography and some other things, but I haven't been able to find any research to confirm it one way or the other. By 1890, Miner had abandoned all plans to try to build a railroad, and he focused all of his energy and attention exclusively to exporting bananas to the United States. They weren't really making any money off of passengers in the railroad, so it kind of made sense. And then by 1899, Miner essentially became the largest exporter of bananas in the world and had crushed most of the competition. And now as you hear this story, you might think that, well, that was a very swift and successful progression that this guy made. He must be wealthy beyond all imagination, and he could probably just retire. What actually ended up happening is the brokerage house that Miner was using to invest his money went belly up. And so in 1899, Miner found himself on the brink of bankruptcy, and the only way to save himself as well as his companies was for Miner's companies to merge with another fruit export company called Boston Fruit, and together those companies ended up forming United Fruit Company, which is unquestionably the big bad villain of this story. Don't you guys just love when you find out that the story you're hearing ends up being a villain origin story? And the United Fruit Company continued to be very, very successful. I mean, just to give you some statistics here, in 1884, there was roughly 0 profit being generated by the banana industry. But then by 1906, the industry was generating $10 million in profits, and that's $10 million in 1906 money. Alexa, how much is $10 million in 1906 worth today?
Please try again later.
Technology, it never works for you. So adjusted for inflation, $10 million in 1906 would be the equivalent of
$10?
$335 million today. That's a whole heck of a lot of bananas. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the banana industry was entirely rainbows and unicorn farts. There were some issues that were faced within the banana industry. You know, number one, it was still a very risky business. Banana farming was susceptible to storms or changes in weather conditions. You also had a very fragile plant grown in a monoculture fashion, and that meant it was susceptible to disease. In fact, the banana that was actually originally popular here in the United States in the late 1800s isn't even the same type of banana we eat today. You see, there was a banana called the Gros Michel, which was a banana that was frequently grown and really consumed, and everybody said it just tasted wonderful. Unfortunately, a disease pretty much wiped that species out, and it's extremely hard to find in this day and age. And while bananas have a variety of characteristics, they can be grown in different colors, shapes, sizes, all of that, the folks at the United Fruit Company knew that they had to replace the Gros Michel with a banana that looked similar, because if it didn't look the same, people wouldn't stand for it. And so what they found was this variety that a horticulturalist in, I think it was in the UK, he ended up producing called the Cavendish. And yes, this guy's name was Cavendish. And now that's the variety of banana we know today. But arguably the biggest challenge to the banana empire, because there was no competition, ended up being how do you keep your labor costs low so that you can make your profits high? And that's how the United Fruit Company got involved in some very, very dastardly politics. So you see, in its earliest years, the United Fruit Company actually had a pretty focused strategy for how they would enter into a new country. Because again, they weren't just operating in one country. You know, they were in Costa Rica, Guatemala, Nicaragua, I believe. And so they typically had a playbook that they would use for how they would operate in each of these countries. They would go into a country, they would make agreements with the local government to build all sorts of various types of infrastructure, and in exchange for building the infrastructure, they would get land rights and or exclusive trade agreements. And because of that, that's how United Fruit Company was able to maintain that monopoly. They would come in, they would build that infrastructure, they'd make that deal with the local government, and they'd be in a position where nobody else could enter into that market. And now they would typically try to portray this as altruistic, saying, oh, hey, look at us, we're in these third world countries and we're building infrastructure for them, aren't we great guys? But the fact of the matter is, they would not have been able to actually produce that fruit if they hadn't built the infrastructure. So it was something that they needed anyways. And you know, it wasn't just railroad type stuff either. You know, United Fruit Company had built the entire telegraph network that was in existence in Central America. They controlled most of the port cities on the Caribbean side of Central America. And in fact, in Guatemala, the United Fruit Company actually operated their post office. The company had tentacles absolutely everywhere, and that's how they ended up getting the name of El Pulpo, which for you non-Spanish speakers actually means the octopus, because, you know, they had those tentacles everywhere controlling everything.
El Nino is Spanish for the Nino.
And while things were actually good when they first came to town, there was pretty quickly resentment growing towards the United Fruit Company for how much control they exhibited over Central America. I think if you're looking at this from the perspective of the history of colonialism, this was an interesting shift, because traditionally there had been companies that had been formed to help colonize different parts of the Western Hemisphere. They usually operated under the charter and governance of some sort of, say, European country. You know, for example, there was the Virginia Company that settled most of Virginia. There was the Plymouth Company that helped settle Massachusetts. That system sort of had been in existence for hundreds of years. But here you had the United Fruit Company, a relatively new and young company that had sprung up organically, but it was now essentially controlling large portions of Central America. And the United Fruit Company very much saw this control as a strategic priority. If they controlled the labor market, if they controlled all the ports and all the shipping and the railroads, they were going to be able to box out any potential competition. They were going to also be able to keep their operating costs low, and that's how they were able to be so wildly successful for many, many years. They had a massive stranglehold on Central America. Again, for example, in Guatemala, United Fruit Company owned or had leases on 1/5 of all farmable land. And I mean, people here in the United States get all paranoid about Bill Gates, but there you have it. These times were definitely great for the United Fruit Company, but they weren't so good for the people who lived in the countries that the United Fruit Company operated in, because the working conditions were absolutely atrocious. You know, the workers lived in these dorms that were filthy and disgusting and barely adequate. They weren't actually paid cash for their work. Instead, they were given coupons and vouchers that they could then use at a company store owned and operated by United Fruit. And so while it wasn't exactly slavery,
where I'm from, that's called slavery.
And the human rights abuses don't stop there. Beatings were often frequently happening. Oftentimes, the wives and daughters of the male workers at the United Fruit Company were forced into sex work, and if they refused, then their husbands or brothers or other family members wouldn't get paid. And so it was really, really horrid stuff happening here. I don't want to freak people out with the number of atrocities, but it was gosh darn horrific that the company known as United Fruit Company, who's now Chiquita Banana, actually was exhibiting towards their workers. The working conditions were so bad that the average life expectancy of a man in Central America at this time, it actually dropped as a result of the deaths of the workers at United Fruit Company. And so to be able to statistically do something like that, I think puts you on par with somebody like R.J. Reynolds in terms of evil corporationdom.
More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
And yes, the local people would try to rebel. There'd be riots and insurrections and murder, like all that stuff was constantly going on in these countries as a result of the operating model of the United Fruit Company. And probably the worst example of this was the banana massacre in Colombia in 1928. You see, in 1928, the workers in Colombia got so fed up with things that they presented United Fruit Company with a list of like 9 demands. And these weren't like crazy things. They were like asking to be paid in cash and be paid a fair wage. And the United Fruit Company thought so little of these folks that they wouldn't even meet with them, because they said that they were basically subcontractors and didn't actually work for the company, so they weren't going to talk to them. Gosh, that's kind of an interesting strategy for a company to pretend like its workers are subcontractors so that they don't have to take responsibility for their workers.
We're charting an even better road for Uber and for those that rely on us every day.
Good thing that sort of thing doesn't happen in this day and age. And now, because United Fruit Company essentially controlled the government of Colombia, they had Colombia enact laws that prevented protests. They also enacted laws that allowed the Colombian government to spy on labor leaders. And eventually everything came to a head when the workers decided to stage a protest and strike. And this general by the name of General Carlos Cortez Vargas, he was made the military leader of the area known as the Banana Zone in Colombia. And on December 6, 1928, hey, get out of my coffee there, girl. And now on December 6, 1928, the Colombian army, with a nod of approval from the United Fruit Company, marched into the town of Cartagena, Colombia, and they executed like a whole bunch of people. Like, I mean, they gave protesters like, I think 60 seconds to get out of the square, and when they didn't get out that quick, they just started opening fire. And the number of people who died was crazy. While the official report said something along the lines of like 40 people died, most folks have it somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 people were murdered on that day during the Banana Massacre. And the truth of the matter is, if you look at a place like Colombia today, a lot of folks will trace the rise of the Colombian drug cartels in like the late 70s and into the 80s and 90s, really connect the dots of that to what happened with United Fruit and the conditions as well as the climate and environment created by the banana industry. It was essentially the forebearer for the cocaine trade. And this pattern of going into a country, acquiring land, manipulating the government, this was like the United Fruit Company's playbook. This was standard operating procedure, really from like the late 1800s all the way into the, I don't know, first half of the 20th century or so. And this is how they ultimately started to overthrow and topple actual governments, which might be the craziest detail of this entire story. You know, little barn cat, when I told you that this story was going to be horrible and explain at the same time how Chiquita Banana overthrew a government, I wasn't making this up. That wasn't meant to be some sort of YouTube hype hyperbole. You see, for the first 20 or 30 years in Guatemala, there was like this ongoing cycle of you know, the workers would start to rebel, the government would crush that rebellion, and you have some sort of strong leader who would be aligned with the interests of the United Fruit Company, and things would go back to normal. And by 1931, there was a general by the name of Jorge Ubico who had become really the leader of Guatemala. And this was a guy who had some very strong connections and ties to both the United Fruit Company as well as the United States government. And both United Fruit and the United States government was actually very happy to have him there. He ruled Guatemala with an iron fist, but he had this very, very weird habit of calling himself the Hitler of Guatemala. Like, it was like a name and title that he took on in pride.
Have you ever read Mein Kampf? A couple times, I guess. Couple times? Are there Easter eggs in there you didn't get the first time?
This is like in the 1930s and 40s when Hitler, particularly in the United States, wasn't a great thing. The United States would be like, hey, Ubico, can you maybe stop calling yourself the Hitler of whatever, whatever? And he'd be like, yeah, sure. Then like the next day he'd call himself the Hitler of Guatemala yet again. And really, just for a life hack piece of advice, don't ever call yourself the Hitler of anything. It's just not a good label to put to yourself. Feel like, yeah, I'm the Hitler of this used car dealership. Yeah, don't do that. And so while Ubico was definitely aligned with the interest of the United Fruit Company, eventually when there was the uprising in 1944, the US government didn't really lift a hand to change anything because they were like, it's probably time for this guy to go. So in October of 1944, there was this big uprising and revolution in Guatemala, and Ubico was gone. And really at that point, it ushered in about 10 years of calm, often known as the 10 years of spring in Guatemala, because things became a lot more progressive. There were more labor protections in place. United Fruit Company's power and influence was starting to diminish. Juan Jose Arevalo became Guatemala's first democratically elected president in 1945, and some of the measures that he put in place really chafed the United Fruit Company, and they were not happy with that. And Arevalo was eventually succeeded in 1951 by Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was even more progressive, and probably the biggest, most impactful policy that Arbenz put in place was something known as the Decree 900, which was essentially a program that was intending to take unused land and redistribute it back to peasants. You see, because United Fruit Company had ownership of significant portions of land in Guatemala, but they weren't necessarily using it all. You know, they were holding on to these large tracts of land and sitting on it, and by preventing local folks from using it for growing food, they were forcing those folks to have really only one option for employment, and also by holding on to that land, they were preventing other companies from coming into Guatemala and creating competition. And so the interest of United Fruit Company were to leave this land undeveloped and just controlled by United Fruit, while in the meantime, Arbenz and really all of the local folks in Guatemala wanted to see that land get used by the people. And now this is where our story takes a crazy, diabolical, if you saw this in a movie and it was a plot twist, you'd think it was stupid type of turn. You see, the United Fruit Company decided to start a PR campaign to paint Arbenz as a communist. And you know, again, this is the early 1950s, McCarthyism is in full flare. The United States is now going to war in the Cold War with Russia, and it's, you know, the capitalist versus the communist. And so that was like the dirtiest thing you could call somebody, which might have some of you asking, was Arbenz actually a communist? And the truth of the matter is no. While he was talking about redistributing land, he wasn't just gonna take it from United Fruit, he was gonna pay them the reported value that they were reporting on their Guatemalan tax returns for it. So it was essentially they were buying unused land back from United Fruit to give to the people. And so, you know, maybe there's certain elements of socialistic thinking in that, but even by the most basic of measures, that could not be considered communist. Okay, so now the stage has been set. We have this guy being painted as a communist by United Fruit. United Fruit wants to get Arbenz out of there. And so how do they do it? Well, pop quiz for everybody. What is the worst airport in the Washington, D.C. metro area? Yes, Reagan National is a horrible airport. Dulles is statistically much, much worse. And this is the part of the story where the Dulles brothers, one of which was the actual namesake, or was the airport named after him? I don't know. Is that a namesake? The airport is Dulles' namesake. Okay. Well, so you see the Dulles brothers, they play a significant role in this. You know, the DC metro area really does have a way of naming airports after some of history's greatest monsters. I mean, you have Dulles, you have Reagan. I'm surprised BWI hasn't actually been renamed as the Andrew Jackson International Airport. But yes, let's take a minute to just give you a little bit of background on the Dulles brothers. You see, you have John Foster Dulles, who served as Secretary of State under Dwight D. Eisenhower. And so at the time of all this Arbenz business, he was the Secretary of State. And then you had John Foster Dulles' brother, Allen Dulles, serving as the head of the CIA at the time.
CIA man.
And I know you're probably watching this video and saying, wait a minute, this was a video about bananas and now you're talking about the Dulles brothers. Why? Well, you see, the Dulles brothers had some very deep connections to the United Fruit Company. You know, before serving as Secretary of State for the United States, John Dulles was a partner at a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, and he frequently and regularly negotiated deals between United Fruit Company and the Guatemalan government. And his brother Allen also worked at the same law firm and did a lot of work with United Fruit as well. But the connections get even crazier because Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the ambassador of the United States to the UN, he was one of the largest owners of United Fruit Company stock at the time. And Ed Whitman, who happened to be the head of PR and communications for the United Fruit Company at the time, he happened to be married to a woman by the name of Ann Whitman, who happened to be Dwight Eisenhower, the sitting president's personal secretary. You know, I will just tell you guys, once you start to see all these connections,
Pepe Sylvia, I look in the mail, well, this whole box is Pepe Sylvia!
So seeing that their United Fruit Company interests were being threatened, the Dulles brothers decided to break out the Banana Republic coup playbook and take down Arbenz. And now what is actually contained in that playbook? Well, let me break it down for you. Step one is you set up a radio station in Miami, Florida, but you pretend like it's actually a radio station based in the Guatemalan jungle. And then step two is you hire a bunch of mercenaries and position them in the jungle on the Guatemalan border and make them look all tough and bad and threatening. And then step three is you go on that same Miami-based radio station and you say, thousands and thousands of well-trained troops have just crossed the border into Guatemala and they're heading for the capital. And then for some added effect and impact, you maybe send a couple of airplanes over the capital city and shoot some machine guns down at buildings, but not really do any damage. And then step four is you let the president of this democratically elected country panic and give over his seat of power. It's a brilliant plan. Horrible, unethical, and wildly manipulative, but it's a pretty good strategy. I will give them that. And so because of this fake coup propagated by the CIA at the behest of the Dulles brothers, you essentially had Arbenz ousted and a man living in exile. And he bounced around in different countries for years after leaving Guatemala, never going back to Guatemala. And eventually he died, I think like in 1971 in Mexico. The official record says that he died of suicide, but some people will say that it was a little bit more suspect than that. But either way, they just absolutely ruined this poor man's life. And even worse than the fate of what ultimately befell Arbenz is what actually ended up happening to Guatemala. Because the ultimate irony in all of this is that the power vacuum that was created by the CIA and their coup that was done at the behest of the United Fruit Company was ultimately something that fueled and gave rise to the power of communists in Guatemala. And so shortly after the coup, there was about 36 years of civil war in Guatemala, which was absolutely horrific. And that led to countless atrocities in the poor country. In fact, that civil war ended up, I think, being the longest civil war in the Western Hemisphere's history. I mean, 36 years, that's, you know, multiple generations of people being born and living in civil war, and it's just horrible. And yeah, that's the price you pay for bananas. And so yes, this has been one awful story combining colonialism, corporate greed, and the taste of bananas. And if you're out there wondering, well, whatever happened to the United Fruit Company? Well, much like any corporation, they decided to rebrand and they became Chiquita Banana.
Bananas taste the best and are the best for you.
I don't know, you still probably buy bananas from today. If you wonder how Chiquita Banana overthrew the government, that right there is the story. If you guys like this farm crime story, be sure to check out another one of our series on this playlist right here, or just watch another one of our videos to learn more about our farm. Thanks for watching, everybody.